The NHL Draft is getting closer, which means that we are closer to some potentially massive NHL Draft deals. And today I want to go through multiple trade rumors that we've heard recently involving the NHL Draft, not just with specific players that could be dealt, but top 10 picks that could get traded. There's a lot to get into in today's video, so make sure you guys watch till the end for all the trade rumor talk, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more draft content as we lead up to the draft. In just a few days, man, it is crazy to think about, but we are almost here. Now, before we get started, today's video is sponsored by Elite Prospects. I'm joined by head honcho of content at EP himself, Cam Robinson, to discuss EP Premium and the newly released NHL Draft Guide. Cam, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. This is the busy season. This is our time to shine. So yeah, it's all good over here.
Cam, every year you guys release the new Elite Prospects Draft Guide, 350 plus player profiles, 5,000 game reports, which is insane. But I want to know from your perspective, what do you believe brings the most value to hockey fans, especially ones that are trying to learn about the draft this year?
It has a little something for everything. So if you are a die-hard nerd and you really want to know like the in-depth, you can read through all those scouting reports that go back to draft -1, draft -2 years, all the way up to, the last game they played of the season there. But if you're just like wanting to get kind of a gauge on what to expect, maybe your team has a couple first round picks this year and you're like, hey, I want to know who could be interesting, is that we have like the elevator pitch, just a quick, 2 sentences. Here's what this player is. Or, we have the shades of, so it gives a little bit of a player comparable to who they might end up being in the NHL. We do the work all year, so you can look smart now on a bunch of players that maybe you haven't even got a chance to watch.
A big thank you to Cam for hopping on with me today. And if you guys want to join Elite Prospects Premium, just use the link in the description to get 33% off your subscription at just $8 a month, with everything included, including the NHL Draft Guide. Thank you to Elite Prospects for sponsoring today's video, and let's get right back into it. Now, jumping into today's video, we're going to start out with the first major bombshell involving the Chicago Blackhawks and their third overall pick. Yeah, you heard me correctly. We have heard quite a bit about a potential major draft day trade involving picks. I mean, Utah especially has been a team that we've heard a lot about potentially being open to moving their fourth overall pick to maybe trade down to the draft or just add a top tier player to their roster. But the Chicago Blackhawks were a bit of a different story, because even though I've speculated they might want to move up in the draft potentially to secure a Michael Misa, for example, that was always kind of just speculation. But according to Frank Cervelli, and as Blackhawks on CHSN's account does put it, the Blackhawks are open to trading their third overall pick. And here was the quote from Frank Cervelli: "I do think they want to be really active on the trade market, and I do think the third overall pick is in play." And this NHL Rumor Report tweet gives us a bit more details on that, saying as well the Blackhawks' third overall pick is in play. But as Frank Cervelli went on to say, they're looking to trade for a true difference maker. And that, I think, is pretty interesting, especially for Chicago, their stage in this rebuild right now. To trade that type of pick, it makes sense they want to get a true difference maker. But I think it really shows that they're open to all options right now. Now, I expect a lot of people to be confused by this situation, asking why the heck Chicago in this stage of the rebuild would want to even trade that third overall pick, especially for somebody now. But when you consider this draft class, especially from Chicago's perspective, I don't think it's all that surprising. When we look at the main three frontrunners, the guys that I think have been linked to Chicago the most at that third overall selection, Anton Frindell, Porter Martone, Caleb Noye, I think all three of these guys are going to be solid NHL players, really efficient top 6 pieces. But I think there is, especially some of it's an upside to players like Anton Frindell, to players like Denoye, and especially if Chicago isn't all that interested in James Hagens, which we've heard is the case, then I think for Chicago, that third overall pick becomes a lot more expendable. There was a reason why I was speculating Chicago potentially moving up in the draft, because when you look at it, I think Chicago is one of those teams that really has Schaefer, Misa in a tier of their own, especially Michael Misa, who I think will be a transcendent piece for them. But if they're not able to get him at that third overall selection, I think there's a pretty steep decline in terms of their interest in those next wave of 2025 draft prospects. So to trade that third overall pick, or maybe even trade down, would not surprise me in the slightest. And I'll say this, with Chicago's lack of interest, it seems, towards James Hagens, and if they aren't really feeling all that comfortable in Porter Martone and his lack of true pace, then I think for Chicago, it absolutely could be the right decision to potentially trade down in this draft, or just trade it for a substantial younger piece that could immediately come in and make Connor Bedard's life a lot easier than it is right now, and will be next year. And hey, with what we've heard, with them not really being all that interested in James Hagens, even though he's my clear number 3, and he's something that I still like quite a bit, in Chicago's system, he doesn't really fit all that that well. They already have a lot of pure pace, smaller forwards. They want to add some bulk to the very top of the lineup. And even though I think a player like Porter Martone would be able to do that, Anton Frindel could have the capacity for it, it's not perfect. And I could see a situation where Chicago is just completely fine trading that pick. We got to remember that this draft has been all over the place all season. Team scouts have vastly different opinions on this draft class. And for a team like Chicago that has some pretty obvious needs, that size, that pure adrenaline, there's not a lot of guys, I would say, in this range that give you that perfectly. Looking at the teams that could potentially be a trade partner for Chicago, it's pretty fascinating because, for one, I don't think Utah is going to be one. They will definitely not be trading up in this draft. That is for sure. You have a team like Philadelphia that I'd be kind of curious about. They're a team that has a few really interesting forward options, for example, that they could give to Chicago, but especially if they really want to secure themselves a Caleb Denoye, for example, if that's the guy they really want to go for, I think trading up to third overall is the best opportunity to do that. I mean, at that point of Utah, if they keep that pick, I think it's either between Caleb Denoye or Brady Martin for that selection. It seems like that's the two players that the Utah Mammoth have liked the most. So if a team like Philly really wants to secure themselves a top guy like that, then it would be the best chance to do so. But other teams that could see in the mix, Seattle, I think, might want to make a splash if they really want to go after a player like a Porter Martone as well to really beef up the right wing of the future. Then getting up to number 3 could take advantage of that, even though I think there's a chance that he could end up slipping in this year's draft. I mean, a team like the Pittsburgh Penguins at 11th overall, they're a team I could absolutely see making a major splash on draft day. I don't know who the Blackhawks specifically would want because the Penguins don't have a lot of really great young established talent. But if they were to do that, I mean, I could easily see the Penguins really liking a player like James Hagens with the pure upside he has, drafting up to 3rd overall, or even a player like a Caleb Denoye and Anton Frindel. They got a lot of options to work with that I'm sure they would appreciate. And hey, we'll talk about this possibility as well further along because it does involve them. But with the New York Islanders, with all the talk around them still wanting to get a James Hagens on top of Matthew Schaefer, end up trading for that 3rd overall selection. I mean, at that point, I think, again, the Sharks are pretty much locked into getting Michael Misa at that 2nd overall spot. At number 3, even though I think you could probably afford to trade down a little bit more than 3 to secure Hagens, if you really wanted him, if you really wanted to make sure of it, then 3rd overall, I think, is the earliest you can go. So even a team like the Islanders, I could see potentially swooping in and trying to make a massive deal happen. I will say, though, the two teams that I still think are the most likely to trade up in the draft and try to get that Chicago pick are the Philadelphia Flyers and the Seattle Kraken. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity where none of the teams that I just even listed that have a top 10 pick just want to trade for that 3rd overall selection. A team comes out of nowhere and offers a massive player. But in terms of the teams that I think are the most likely to trade their own top 10 pick to trade up to Chicago, this is what I think makes the most sense. The two players that I see as the most likely to potentially go from Philly to the Blackhawks are both Owen Tippett and Tyson Forrester. Now, even though I think Travis Konecny would be the perfect choice for the Blackhawks, there's no chance in heck the Flyers are trading him at this point. He's too solidified on that team as one of the true leaders there, and I just don't think it's all too likely. Owen Tippett, I think, is maybe the most likely to get dealt just because of his contract being all over the place and him as a player kind of being all over the place. He's had some good moments here and there for Philly, but has failed to really get this stretch of great play. He's somebody that got 28 goals, 53 points last year, some pretty good offensive totals, but there's times where you just want more intensity out of him. You want just more pure work ethic, which just has kind of been a bit of a disappointment with the Flyers so far. But he's locked in at $6.2 million for a long-term contract. So if Chicago wants some stability, then I think Tippett could make sense. If they want to go for a bit of a younger piece that also has some pretty good goal scoring to him, Tyson Forrester is another one as well. Just recently signed a 2-year, $3.75 million contract. So a bridge deal, which makes things, I think, a little more likely for Forrester to get traded compared to if you got a massive 8-year contract extension. But he's something that is really coming to his own. And you see in 81 games this last year, 25 goals, 43 points, the goal scoring being a major component. I mean, that to me would be a huge player to add to your middle six. And I mean, could step up, of course, to that first line and play with Connor Bedard if he really needs to, but would give him a goal scoring element that he hasn't quite had the ability to work with yet. Plus, an underrated part of this as well is that both Bedard and Tyson Forrester were teammates at the 2022 U20 World Juniors, so they have experience already being teammates. Why not link up again in Chicago? Though, again, I do think Philly is way more likely to want to give up a player like Owen Tippett, but if it's Tyson Forrester, I don't think you'd give up as much draft capital, so something for Philly to potentially think about. Even though I think Forrester would carry a lot of value for the Flyers, I still think you'd probably have to give up more than just Forrester and that 6th overall pick. Maybe a mid-round pick. I don't think they'd have to give up another first rounder, for example, to make that happen, but something on top of that, which I don't think would be the biggest deal for the Flyers in the world, especially if they are able to lock in somebody they love, if it's a player like Denoye or Frindel, for example. But again, a pretty big thing to consider here as Philly really considers a massive draft for themselves. themselves. I mean, I think the big thing that could maybe stop this from happening is just how volatile this draft is in general, with how many players could potentially drop down in the draft, especially if a Brady Martin, for example, goes 4th overall, then that almost locks you in the ability to get a player like a Frendell, a Denoye, or a James Hagens as well. So in that case, if I'm Philadelphia, I'm not quite sure if I would go for it, especially if it costs a player like Forrester. But again, if they really want that 3rd overall pick and really want somebody specific, then I think you might have to make it happen here. Now, I wanted to move on to another potential trade inside the top 10 of the draft. This one potentially involving the New York Islanders and the Boston Bruins. And this one coming from RJ Media. Bruins-Islanders trade talks are heating up. And it's not just about Pajot. Sources confirm the number 7 pick and James Hagens are in play. Now, this was a pretty interesting article by Jimmy Murphy laying down the situation because reportedly by Steven Rossner, great beat reporter for the Islanders, there has been a lot of negotiation between the Isles and the Bruins about Jean-Gabriel Pajot, but it hasn't just been about that. It seems to have gone even further than that, potentially involving the Bruins and their 7th overall selection. According to his source, they said, I know the Islanders are being creative and looking at multiple options. Why not keep the top pick, get Matthew Schaefer and Hagens somehow? Do the Bruins want to jump to number 1? Of course, I'm not sure they're willing to offer up what they would take. I know the Bruins believe they can turn the 7th overall pick into a solid player for their roster this coming season. What that means as far as the Islanders roster is concerned, I don't know. Another wrinkle in this as well is another source confirms that the Bruins have had interest prior in Noah Dobson, who of course this year is a pending RFA, one of the biggest pending RFAs in the league, and that makes things even more interesting. So on top of the Bruins having interest in potentially trading for Pajot, they could also potentially trade for Noah Dobson, which if they're there together in the same package, that 7th overall pick is as good as gone. And an interesting wrinkle as well here in the second half of the article says that Don Sweeney and Director of Amateur Scouting at Ryan Deneau sent out smoke signals that the 7th overall pick was in play. And then goes on to say, based on what I'm hearing, the goal is to move him to the top 5. But if they can't do that, with the drop-off after the top 5, they would like to use the 7th overall pick in a trade package that could get them a player for their lineup now. And this is fascinating because we were just talking about the Chicago Blackhawks and their 3rd overall pick potentially being in play. What if the Boston Bruins, after all the scariness about them potentially winning the draft lottery, they go up and trade up into the top 3 of the draft? I mean, it would certainly make things especially interesting. I don't even know who they would pick at that selection because I think a player like Porter Martone, who I think would be perfect for them at 7th overall, has a pretty decent chance at this rate to be available, if not a player like James Hagens. So potentially the Bruins are maybe more inclined for a Caleb Noye, maybe an Anton Frendell if they really enjoy that. I think that would be kind of the only reason they would see it as all that likely to trade up inside the top 3 to get one of those 2 guys. But I think for the Bruins, if they want to really juice up that prospect pool, I mean, trading up to the top 3 would certainly be a good step to doing that. And hey, we already know, of course, that Utah potentially could be trading that 4th overall pick, so we could potentially see a swap with the Bruins and the Utah Mammoth instead. So my goodness, it seems like basically every single team inside the top 10, not including the San Jose Sharks, has options on the trade market, has interest that they might be going after, and ways to get maybe another top 10 pick, or to trade down, or to trade up. I cannot keep track of all of this, man. Noah Dobson, though, is really the big one, because we had mock trades, and we talked about it. You guys had mock trades about Noah Dobson potentially being traded for that 4th overall pick, but there's options, I think, for a team like the Bruins to really want to play like Dobson, really bring a player like that in with the offense he provides, and potentially trade that 7th overall selection. So there's a lot that could be in play here. There's a lot between different teams in that top 10 that could be in play, but a very fascinating next couple of weeks as we see what happens here. Just keep an eye on the Islanders, man, and with Noah Dobson specifically, because that is the golden ticket if they want to get another top 10, top 7 pick. Now, I want to talk about a couple players that we've also seen in trade rumors recently that could also factor in towards draft trades. One is Bowen Byum, who we've heard a lot about potentially being dealt. He's some of the Sabres have been up and down on in terms of their stock in him, and it seems like is a pretty likely candidate to be dealt this summer. In this latest Hockey Writers article, they went through a report by Rick Dhaliwal, and according to him, several teams are monitoring the situation in Buffalo involving Bowen Byum. Dhaliwal noted on Donnie and Dolly that he would not be surprised if the Canucks are in the mix. Adrian Dater went even further, writing, I believe Byum wants to be a Canuck, and certainly a lot to go off there. As they go on to write, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the Canucks to prioritize Byum when their need at forward is stronger. However, there might be a bigger trade here, or thoughts behind the scenes that the organization needs a plan B in the event Quinn Hughes leans towards leaving. If Hughes is gone, Byum becomes a critical piece of the blue line, and absolutely there. I mean, to me, I don't think the Canucks should be prioritizing anything, because they should be prioritizing everything at this rate. The defense was also a bit of a suspect expect part of the system last year, and it still wasn't perfect by any means. So even though I think the offense does need to improve a little bit, I would say for Vancouver, a pretty big prioritization should be adding more offense from the back end. And although Bowen Byum has his issues, I mean, you can't deny the skill that he possesses. If he does pop, if he plays the best of his level, that's a top 4 defenseman for Vancouver to potentially add. So yes, I would agree going for a center especially is a massive need for the Canucks right now, but I mean, who knows? This summer could be absolutely insane that we see Bowen Byum sent to Vancouver and then he gets flipped for a center potentially at the draft or after free agency. I would not even be surprised to see that happen. I mean, Vancouver especially has done some pretty crazy things over the last year, so do not count them out in anything right now. But absolutely, I would expect Bowen Byum to get dealt by Buffalo, and I do think the Canucks, in terms of the stylistic fit, actually do fit pretty well for Bowen Byum and what he needs going forward. I think they give him some pretty good opportunity behind Quinn Hughes, but again, that center situation is a bad need right now. The last player I want to mention here today in terms of the trade rumor mill, especially when it comes to the draft this year, is JJ Peterka, who is a fascinating one because it feels like a couple months ago we first heard that he could be available, then things really died down, but especially over the last couple of weeks, things have been brought back up again, and it seems more likely than ever that Peterka will get dealt. And especially among the potential offer sheet candidates this year, I think Peterka was one of the most fascinating ones. And then we just got a recent update here from Elliot Freeman of the 32 Thoughts podcast reporting that the talks between the Sabres and Peterka may have shifted. He noted, "I have said the Sabres have indicated that they don't want to trade JJ Peterka. Their answer has changed." Then Freeman believes the organization is now listing on trade offers. People know Peterka's unhappy and it's believed that he would like to go somewhere else. And I just think that reality is sinking in a bit for the Sabres. I think Buffalo realizes they have to at least look into it. And absolutely, if the public the consensus, especially privately among teams, that they know Peterka is unhappy, that makes him even more of an offer sheet candidate and somebody you do not want to lose. You want to have that leverage and you want to be able to trade him if that's the reality. And it seems like at this point, Buffalo needs to make this happen. This is really a sucky situation to me, man, because I think Peterka has been a great fit in Buffalo and exactly what they needed more of. The production and what he's been able to do year after year has been just been better and better since the last. You see this last year, 68 points in 77 games. He's really been one of the great success stories for the Sabres team and this current rebuild they've been on. And to have him go, especially after all this development in him, would be just horrible. It would be awful to see, and that's exactly why it's going to happen to the Buffalo Sabres, because it always seems to happen. And of course, in like 4 years, he's going to win the Stanley Cup on some Florida team. It doesn't seem like Peterka is all that unhappy with the Sabres team itself. They've given him quite a bit of opportunities, but the management and of course the contract negotiations, it seems like both parties are on different islands in terms of what they want and what they think is realistic. And in Peterka's case, I think he deserves to get paid. He's been one of the best European younger players in the league these last couple of seasons. Again, progressing in so many critical areas. Yes, there have been times you want a little bit more activity in his game, but my goodness, the production at 23 years old, you don't get many players that have been as productive as Peterka has been. But this also relates to the Sabres and their 9th overall pick. They have a lot to consider at this year's draft. They could potentially trade down or potentially trade up with that Peterka trade if it were to happen that way. So maybe a team like Chicago that we also mentioned before could potentially trade for JJ Peterka, trade away that 3rd overall pick. There's options here for this Buffalo Sabres team, but my goodness, things are going to get interesting as we lead up to the draft this year. But those are the latest trade rumors surrounding the NHL draft this year. A lot to talk about here today, and thank you guys so much for joining me. If you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell for more videos just like this leading up to the draft this year. Of course, share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and of course, comment down below all your thoughts on the trade rumors we talked about today, what you think could potentially happen, which teams in the top 10 do you think could potentially trade their pick in this year's draft. Let me know all your thoughts, and of course, click on this card for all my draft content running one playlist, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day. And goodbye.